Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome everyone. I'm Berta Snilstveit, the Director of Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE and head of our London office. And it's a real pleasure for me to open this first session in our evidence dialogue series on what works for investing in smarter climate action, co-convened by 3IE and what works climate solutions. It's always nice to have a sense of who is in our audience, so I would invite you all to say hello in the chat, your name, your organization, and where you are based. I would like to also warmly welcome and thank our panelists for starting this series with us today. We have Martin Prowse, evidence specialist on climate evaluation from the University of East Anglia. We have Jan Minks, head of the Evidence for Climate Solutions Working Group at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and also lead at the What Works Climate Solutions. Clarice Panyin Nian, Research and Evidence Synthesis Fellow at the International Center for Evaluation and Development, and our own Constanza Gonzalez Parao, who's a Senior Evaluation Specialist at 3IE. Thank you all for being part of this first conversation. We're meeting at a moment when the urgency to address climate action is unmistakable. Billions of dollars are invested in climate interventions every year in forest protection, clean energy, climate smart agriculture, resilience building, and more. But an essential question remains. Do we know what works, what doesn't, for whom, and what is most cost effective? These are not just academic questions. They are central to how we make better decisions for a sustainable future, especially in low and middle income countries where the effects of climate change are most acute. So this first session is an opportunity to take stock of an evolving evidence base across climate-related sectors. We want to look carefully at where research is gaining traction and where critical gaps remain. Those gaps may not only be in the evidence itself, but also relate to the way that we engage. Researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and funders are not in the room together often enough to shape the questions, interpret the findings, and develop ways to institutionalize and incentivize evidence use. While we should understand the limitations of the current evidence base, we should be equally clear that incomplete evidence is not a reason for inaction. The available climate evidence can and should be used to drive better decisions today. This session also invites us to examine the case for greater ambition, stronger coordination, and more strategic investment to fill the gaps that matter most for people and the environment. It's a chance to bring together like-minded people who are passionate about evidence-informed climate action and to build a broader movement for evidence-informed climate interventions, one that is rigorous, practical, and responsive to the scale of the challenge before us. Before we start, a few notes on housekeeping. We will begin with a few rounds of questions to our panelists, and then we'll open the floor to questions from our audience. So please post your questions to our panelists using the Q&A function. And not the chat. And then we'll try and bring as many of these into our discussion as possible. The event is live streamed on YouTube and shared on social media. And so if you're joining via live stream, leave your questions in the comment box. Finally, we encourage you to share questions or points of view on social media. Please tag 3IE and include our hashtag evidence dialogue in your posts. And so without further ado, let's start with the first question for our panelists. Based on your experience reviewing evidence on climate change interventions, what's the overall state of causal evidence for the areas that you have focused on? What are the main patterns you see in the evidence in terms of clusters, according to sectors, locations, or intervention types? So we'll start with Jan, and then Clarice, Martin, and Constanza. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Birte, and thank you for the invitation to you and the entire 3IE team. I think it's fantastic that you're leading on this and that you've set up this dialogue series. Let me maybe, with answering this question, frame a little bit around the real urgency for an evidence-based approach, building on what Birte has already said. We need to be really clear we are not on track with climate, and because we are at the moment still on a pattern of emissions growth, despite 3 decades of climate policies that we've seen, and emissions still continue to grow. This means we are still stuck in the age of fossil fuels, and we need to not only to turn around, we need to get to net zero emissions. That means this is a fundamental challenge, and to achieve that, I think it should be quite intuitive that we need to have an evidence-based approach, because we need to be fast, we need to be thrifty, and we have huge investments to shoulder, and we can't waste any money there. I think in the climate field, what we've done, I perceive in terms of evidence is, on the positive side, we've actually been really well to create modeling evidence that helps us to identify how to move forward. So to evaluate alternative future pathways that get us to net zero. That is, I think, one really important piece of evidence that we have generated. But we are lacking a little bit that other piece. We are lacking the evidence that helps us to learn from these hundreds and hundreds of policies that we have already implemented. Because learning, it's all about learning in science and in policy, and we need evidence for this to understand what we are doing right and what we are doing not so well. On the positive side, we have a growing amount of evaluation evidence now, but still most climate policies, or climate-related policies, I should say, remain unevaluated, and also many poorly evaluated. This means we are still lacking this culture of learning, or we need to further build it and grow it, because this is actually nothing that is very sustainable. More fundamental, I think, on the side of primary causal evidence, I think I see that we are developing methods. We are developing new methods. We are slowly building evidence. We have an even stronger challenge on the evidence synthesis side, because I don't think that in climate we have a very good culture of synthesizing on the causal evidence that we have, and this is a situation at the science policy interface that we need to change. We are still relying heavily, and I'm talking here from my experiences in various science assessment processes like the IPCC and the UNEP Gap report. We are heavily relying on traditional literature review, and we all know how biased these can be, and sometimes they are also wrong. And what we also know from these policy processes, which have been quite impactful, is that we are using the causal evidence that we are not managing to bring the causal evidence that is there to the forefront. And evidence synthesis in this context is a critical stage. So I want to finish this first intervention, because we shouldn't take longer than 5 minutes, with 5 things I think we need to do. I think we need to build to develop an evidence culture in climate, and that means in the production, curation, and use of evidence. I think that's really important, and that's what 3IE is trying to do. That is what Works tries to do. I think it's really fundamental. We need to actually build an evidence bank with all this causal evidence of experimental and quasi-experimental studies that we have, as well as the rigorous syntheses, and make them much more accessible. I think is the second important piece. To do this, because we are still quite at the beginning in primary and secondary research, we need to use AI responsibly for the scaling. Fourth point is, I think climate is a real opportunity area where we can actually integrate ex ante and ex post evidence in policy making, because I think this is critical. So far, we are in different camps and are not doing this together and using, or too rarely we are using this evidence together. And finally, I think we need to leapfrog on evidence synthesis development and go to a culture, towards a living evidence culture, where we always try to be up to date in the things that we are doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. Clarice, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bette, and thanks to 3IE for giving us the opportunity. So Ian, thank you so much for those ending recommendations. I will delve right deep into an evidence and gap map we created at the International Center for Evaluation and Development. So it was on climate change adaptation interventions for enhancing food security and livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa. So our EGM mapped 376 studies on climate change adaptation interventions on agriculture. So this was across sub-Saharan Africa. We focused on food security and livelihood outcomes. So let me share what we found. So the overall state of causal evidence is actually limited. And most studies are summative evaluations or non-experimental designs. So rigorous impact evaluations accounted for just under a third of the evidence base. And we found only 15 systematic reviews, just like Yang pointed. So a smaller number of them are given the breadth of the field. So while the volume of research has grown remarkably since 2013, the quality and depth of causal evidence has not kept the pace, unfortunately. So on patterns, there are three particular patterns that are striking. So first of all, I'll say crop production, which dominates the evidence. So over 70% of our studies focused on crop-based interventions, improved variety, soil and land management, water management. So these are connected overwhelmingly to food availability as the primary outcome. This tells us the field has built a reasonably coherent, if not narrow, body of evidence around farm-level production resilience. So secondly, other agricultural systems are severely understudied. So for example, livestock systems, fisheries and aquaculture, and energy systems together accounts for a fraction of the evidence. So this is a significant gap because for many or most of the climate vulnerable communities, where we have pastoralists, fishing communities, and agro-pastoralists, these systems are either primary livelihoods. The evidence base simply does not reflect their reality. Thirdly, on geography, which is heavily skewed. So Eastern Africa dominates the field, which accounted for about 43% of studies, with Ethiopia, Kenya, and of course Ghana contributing disproportionately. In Central Africa, for example, one of the most ecologically complex and climate vulnerable sub-regions, which has barely many representation with under 2% of studies. Western and Southern Africa sit in the middle. So this geographic concentration means that our understanding of what works is shaped by a subset of contexts, but not what is being transferred to others. On outcomes, I did mention it was on food availability. Food availability is studied extensively, but food utilization, food system stability, and broader livelihood dimensions, such as employment, poverty, human and social capital, are usually very, very limited. Yeah. Thank you very much, Betty.
Thank you so much, Clarice, for sharing your work. Maybe we can get someone share a link in the chat to this piece so folks can take a look. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Berthe, and thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be on this panel with Dan, with Clarice, and with Constanza. So hopefully I'll stay within the 5 minutes, but you can keep me to that time limit, Berthe. And so overall, at a high level, I see two clear trends. So on the causal evidence on mitigation, this isn't following the science. So we have some evidence on solar, and 3IE is involved with that, along with sustainable energy for all. But we don't have any causal evidence on wind. And these are the two big hitters for mitigation, right? And in terms of the next three big hitters for mitigation, we've got ecosystems, forests, agriculture. So we have evidence in these areas, but there are questions on quality. There are questions on quality of evidence. So the second trend I see is for adaptation, as Clarice has explained really, really well in terms of the EGM. There's a lack of causal evidence, but when we look over all the different adaptation reviews, we see a lack of a standard classification of interventions across reviews, and this is something I feel that we could. So I'm going to cover some findings from reviews on mitigation, adaptation, and a cross-cutting review. So for mitigation, I'm going to focus on forestry and private sector investments in mitigation. So in forestry, we updated recent work, recent reviews. We had 325 studies, and it shows more evidence than previous reviews. But the evidence is still located within 3 intervention areas that the other reviews highlighted: protected areas, community-based forest management, and pests. The outcome areas are remaining the same as well. Studies measure forest cover or income livelihoods, but very few studies do both, and very few studies look at the trade-offs therein. There's a clear gap in terms of conservation of mangroves, and mangroves have a very, very high climate value. So there's an evidence need there. And in terms of saturated cells within the EGM, there are more of these now, and we focused on land tenure reforms. And this shows a slight improvement in forest cover, but no effect on deforestation or income expenditure. The review on private sector investments was very thin, 32 studies, some on domestic solar and household energy, and some firm investments in efficiency, emissions reductions. And some of these benefited from tax incentives and so forth. But overall, it's a really thin evidence. On adaptation, I'll just focus on one overview and then on water. So the overview had 464 studies. And what's really struck me looking at that review was the unique way it categorized the intervention categories. So it used 4 sectors and then nested 7 intervention types under those 4 sectors. The evidence was mainly on sub-Saharan Africa and on agriculture. And so there are 2 points to raise around the overview. So for adaptation overviews or reviews, really the sectoral definitions, as Jan highlighted and as intimated by Clarice, we need some standardization and harmonization across the reviews. So these could be consistent with IPC sectoral definitions, which would allow this harmonization. And secondly, there's this huge amount of overlap with international development here. So 3IE, 3IE is really in the driving seat. So we have a competitive advantage there on adaptation. On water, we looked at coastal and terrestrial interventions. It had 172 studies, and it showed a concentration of evidence on water efficient irrigation, on ecosystem-based watershed management, and on formal regulatory frameworks. There was a real gap on coastal interventions, so there's an evidence need around coastal interventions. The systematic review found water efficient irrigation works. It improves intermediate outcomes and final outcomes, dietary diversity, food security. It found that ecosystem-based watershed management improved intermediate outcomes only, like. So just before concluding, I'll just offer some findings from the cross-cutting review, and that's on behavioral science, the study of our behavior. So the EGM had 84 studies with most evidence sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and it focused on WASH, finance, energy, agriculture, mainly adaptation outcomes. We conducted meta-analysis on 5 intervention areas, and we found that feedback works in reducing electricity and water consumption. Mainly, well, the effects are largest in sub-Saharan Africa and when implemented by government. And we also found that reminders work in terms of the acquisition of knowledge, especially in South Asia. So as Jan highlighted at the start, we do have causal evidence, and there are pockets of this, but the way that we're synthesizing them varies, and there's a need for greater harmonization and alignment. So this review on behavioral science and the reviews on water, these are in a special issue on climate evidence reviews. So that's in a recent edition in the European Journal of Development Research. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Bert.
Thanks, Martin, for a very wide-ranging and rich response. Constanza, over to you.
Thank you, Birte. I'd like to offer three perspectives on the state of the evidence based on our recent mapping projects that we had completed at 3IE that will resonate with what the other panelists have raised. While these different projects have focused on different climate sectors, we are seeing a rapidly expanding body of evidence from low and middle income countries. But it's highly concentrated in different settings, in specific settings, interventions, outcomes, and research types. So the first set of mapping, we updated an evidence gap map, an EGM, and you may be aware that 3IE evidence gap maps include rigorous impact evaluations and systematic reviews. And this update was focused on land use change and forestry programs. And after 7 years, the number of studies had tripled, but remained highly concentrated on evaluations around protected areas, community or decentralized forest management, land rights, and PEFs. It mostly covered programs in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and East Asia and the Pacific. And it mostly reported on short-term outcomes, such as forest coverage and household income or expenditure measures. Then we substantially expanded the scope of this map to programs that address climate change and biodiversity loss across other natural systems and productive activities, and kept seeing similar patterns. Compared to land and forests, we found far fewer impact evaluations across agriculture and livestock, aquaculture and fisheries, and coasts and oceans. We still saw a majority of evaluations from the same regions and reporting on short-term environmental and human well-being outcomes. And as was mentioned before, I think most interestingly, we noted that studying both environmental and human well-being outcomes as co-impacts is rare. And this means we could and we should be doing more to explore those trade-offs and synergies at the intersection between climate, biodiversity, and livelihoods. The second perspective is around our mapping of the evidence on sustainable energy, aligned with the three outcome targets for SDG 7, access, efficiency, and renewable energy. This is another large body of evidence with more than 700 studies, half of which were published in the 3 years before we completed the map. Studies were mostly conducted in Sub-Saharan Africa, and with evaluations, of environmental policies and regulations in China taking much of this body of research. The evidence of these energy interventions are most common around 4 types: regulations and policies, subsidies, on-grid electrification projects, and sustainable upgrades, with evaluations of improved cook stoves on health outcomes being the most common type of evaluation in the map. But yet again, we frequently saw short-term outcomes related to energy saving or consumption and household individual income savings and expenditure measures. Lastly, we completed an EGM on resilience interventions, focused on well-being among populations experiencing intersecting vulnerabilities, including those from climate change. This body of evidence is smaller comparatively and focused on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where drought and floods, among a few others, were the most common shocks, stressors, and crises in the context of these interventions. Half of these programs were multi-component, where environmental and natural resource management was one of the most commonly combined strategies for resilience. And once again, we mostly identified short-term outcomes, including income savings and asset ownership, as well as measures related to the use of different coping strategies. And to finish, let me offer the last three patterns across all of this body of evidence across sectors. First, these impact evaluations rely heavily and almost exclusively on quasi-experimental designs rather than randomized evaluations. Secondly, cost data of these programs is rarely available across the board. And third, all of this mapping highlights a lack of high quality and recent systematic reviews, which is just a direct call for us to pair this increase in impact evaluations of climate programs with more and better synthesis of the evidence base. Thank you. Back to you, Birte.
Thanks, Constanza, and thanks to all of the panelists for a whirlwind tour of the evidence base. So now for Clarice and Jan, what do you think explains this distribution in the pattern of the evidence? Why does the evidence base look the way that it does?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Betty. So I would say there are several factors that drive this distribution. Research follows funding. Crop-based adaptation has received the most donor and development bank investment. So it naturally generates the most evaluable programs or researchable programs. So interventions like improved seed varieties and soil management are also open to controlled evaluation than complex multi-actor systems such as fisheries governance or pastoral risk management. With regards to institutional incentives, these are concentrated research in more accessible contexts. So Ethiopia, Kenya, and Ghana have strong research institutions, and these are established, they have established international partnerships and more permissive data environments. Central Africa usually faces fragility, conflict, and weaker research infrastructure. So their conditions make them rigorous evaluations harder and less likely to be attempted. With regards to outcome measurements, this is also path dependent, actually. So food availability has standardized, validated metrics that are relatively straightforward to collect at household level. So when we are measuring food system stability, nutrition quality, or the social dimensions of livelihoods, and this requires longer follow-ups, more complex designs, and greater resources. So researchers and evaluators default to what is measurable, actually. So the result is usually a self-reinforcing cycle. So evidence accumulates where it is already concentrated, gaps persist where the work is supposed to be hardest, and the populations most vulnerable to climate change remain least studied. In short, the evidence follows the money, the infrastructure, and the path of least resistance. So until we deliberately redirect research attention toward the hardest context and the most excluded populations, the patterns we see in the map will still persist, and the communities most exposed to climate change will remain the least understood. Thank you very much, Betty. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you so much. I haven't talked about specific patterns so far. At What Works, we're trying to now collect causal evidence across the field. And what we are realizing, similar to what has been said, are a few observations that I want to comment. So overall, we have thousands of studies now, which is good, means quasi-experimental and experimental studies across instruments, sectors, and so on. But as I said, most policies are still unevaluated because we have also thousands of policies, right? So most of the policies are not evaluated. And then we have, first of all, regional biases. So much of the evidence is in high-income countries. And I think the reason for this is clear. Most of the climate policies have been implemented in those countries, but also obviously a lot of climate-related policies are also taking place in developing countries, but there are also more resource constraints, right? So I think that pattern is quite clear. What is now super interesting is that actually the evaluation evidence across many mitigation policies is actually dominated by China. And so we have 80 to 90% of studies currently are produced in China. And this is actually quite a systematic pattern of policy evaluation that is actually taking place in China. And I think that's super interesting and hasn't actually received so much attention, but I think it's super interesting. Then, of course, and this has been mentioned before, there are disciplinary biases, right? So where I'm coming from, the economics, I mean, pricing schemes tend to be much more evaluated than regulations, for example. Therefore, also, the power sector tends to be much deeper evaluated because many of those schemes are taking place in that sector than other sectors like the industry sector. And in a similar way, you can go to other fields and have similar patterns. And I think here, this is really important that I feel that we need a much stronger engagement with the users of evidence, because at the moment, the producers of the evidence are driving it, and we are in science, we are developing according to the scientific value of the study and not for its value for policy. And I think that really needs to urgently change. And then, of course, the last thing, and I've mentioned this already, but I want to say it again, is the lack of high quality, rigorous evidence syntheses, even where we have a lot of primary causal evidence. It's often not so well synthesized. Again, there are pockets, like in the behavioral science, where we find more, or everywhere where experimental research designs are more prevalent. We also find more higher quality evidence syntheses, but otherwise, there is a much deeper lack of those. And I think that's simply explained by the lack of the culture. Over to you, Birte.
Thank you, Jan and Clarice. Those observations really resonate. Turning to Martin and Constanza, from your research experience, are there examples of highly effective transformational interventions that you would like to call out that we should be learning from? And conversely, are there examples of interventions that have failed to deliver on their promise based on the evidence?
Thanks, Birte. And I can offer one example of a review on transformational change, and was supported by Jan. And this combined an EGM with a systematic review on energy. So we included studies with a large scale of change, so over a district or with more than 1,000 units, and which showed a sustained change, so for a year or more. And we hoped to find effect sizes which showed a large depth of change of over 0.8, so a Cohen's d effect size of greater than 0.8. We found 96 studies in our EGM of energy, and the systematic review focused on two areas. So firstly, the effect of electrification on women's employment, where we found just under a 2 percentage point increase. Second, and this is the area that I want to focus on quickly, is we looked at the pilot Chinese emissions trading scheme, and which on first glance showed a reduction of emissions of around 17%. So this represented a Cohen's d figure of about 1, which according to our metric and our schema, this was a transformational change. But when we looked a bit deeper and we looked at the funnel plots, we had some concerns. So the studies were clustered really close to the significance the boundaries for significance. So we conducted an estimate of an unbiased effect size, and this reduced the effect size by more than half. So you could say a large, not transformational, but large. And the significance of this is really the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. So parties to the agreement are starting to make progress with Article 6.4. So this allows trade in carbon credits across countries, and it's the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism. So we're now seeing a lot of movement on Article 6.4, which is also called the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, for which is the kind of updated name. So we're seeing more methodological tools come on stream. We're seeing a modular build out of the IT system within the UNFCCC to track the stages that the projects pass through to achieve certified emission reduction credits. And we've also now seen the first new carbon credit being issued for an Article 6.4 project. So in terms of areas to watch out and keep an eye on, this is certainly one of them. Over to you, Berta, I think.
Constanza.
Constanza.
Thank you. So I don't think I have a magic recipe for interventions that will be highly effective and transformational based on our recent projects. But I'm going to provide two examples from our work that have, I'm going to say, the potential to be transformational with some implementation considerations. The first example is based on 3IE's Agriculture Insurance Evidence Window, our flagship evidence program for testing technology and risk insurance options to build farmers' productivity, incomes, and resilience to climate change. This was a 10-year program that began with formative evaluations of a range of promising interventions, and a handful of those then were selected for rigorous impact evaluations, including both agricultural insurance products and combinations of insurance with other financial and non-financial product services. And what we found is that agricultural insurance offers the greatest return when it's bundled with microloans, by facilitating farmers access to finance for agriculture production while de-risking loans for the financial sector. And despite its critical role for shifting risk from vulnerable farmers, agriculture insurance is a challenging intervention hampered by supply side, demand side, and delivery issues. But we learned that insurance embedded loans gave farmers the ability to increase agricultural expenditures and make investments with greater autonomy. And tech-based platforms such as picture-based insurance helped address barriers to delivery, including costliness of claims verification. The second example that I want to talk about draws from a systematic review of off-grid or decentralized electrification technologies, most commonly in this review around solar. So to your point of the lack of programs around wind. So think solar mini-grids, solar lamps, and alike, which derived from the sustainable energy EGM that I mentioned a little bit before. We found that the primary value of off-grid technologies was to provide energy access to rural populations and reduce reliance of traditional fuels like kerosene. So both addressing energy poverty and climate goals simultaneously. We also found positive but small effects on income, time spent studying, and women's empowerment. However, implementation can also be challenging, as with most interventions, and considering local contexts, implementation mechanisms, and program design choices. So, for example, subsidies versus the free provision of a technology, or individual versus community ownership models significantly affect the uptake and the sustainability of these technologies. Back to you. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to take some, there are some great questions coming through. So I would like us to try and respond to some of those before we move on with some further questions from me. So there is a question about, are there specific barriers to the use of evaluative evidence in the climate sector that are distinct from the typical barriers found in other sectors, such as it being supply-led, timing issues, format of presentation, lack of co-creation, etc. And then also, Jan, you said that the climate domain does not have a culture of synthesis. Do you have thoughts on why this is? Is it lack of knowledge, lack of will? What is it? So I think let's start with those, and I'd like to open the floor to those who feel called, perhaps starting with Jan.
Yeah, maybe also to clarify my maybe a strong statement on evidence and lack of evidence synthesis culture, and I mean evidence synthesis culture in a traditional sense. So basically, a culture of using evidence synthesis methods, particularly for synthesizing empirical evidence. I think what we have in climate is a very good evidence synthesis culture for modeling, which we don't find in other fields that do traditionally much better evidence synthesis. So we have developed this tool of intermodal comparison exercises where you actually set up models in a way, in the first instance, you harmonize them before you run suites of comparable scenarios so that you can actually, in the first instance, at all compare the evidence that those models are generating and get a feel for the uncertainties that are involved. Because as with our evidence synthesis tools, when models are not harmonized, we can't do much. And I think that was very successful, and also in the is, I think, at the root of the success of organizations like the IPCC. So climate scientists have done a very good evidence synthesis job in this modeling field. Only in maybe working with empirical data, this is less so. And I think the reason being probably that we have been focusing a lot on modeling because it's a forward-looking problem. And so we have not invested in the same way in looking back and learning. And I think this is what we are now starting to do. And I think that is what we still want to reinforce. But I want to give others the chance also to respond. So I stop here.
Happy to chime in. Just on the climate specificity of evaluative evidence. So perhaps unlike some other sectors, finance for climate intervention in developing countries is channeled through a number of climate funds. And then the decision-making processes within the climate funds are a partly technical endeavor, of course, with a project proposal from an entity and then reviews of that. But there's also a highly political endeavor in the sense of having to meet the investment criteria, which have been mandated by the board of the fund, and also to make sure that the investment parameters are within the fund that are maintained through time. So I think one point that we could consider is the timing of the evidence to those people making the decisions, and in terms of getting the evidence to them really at a decision point or just before decision point, so that when they're having to choose between different projects in terms of, oh, we need this project to meet this investment criteria or investment parameter, then, oh, this project is gold standard and this one's bronze standard, right? So I'm not sure how that reflects with other sectors, but that's my limited experience of climate. Just the climate finance that runs through climate funds. Obviously, there's many other forms of climate finance. But yeah, over.
And if I can add to the point of challenges, so the other side of what John was raising, so that on the side of evaluations of if you want social programs connected to climate, I think that I want to emphasize, this has been mentioned before, but I want to emphasize the availability of data and of quality data. The China example, it's a great example, and they have implemented a range of energy policies and regulation. And there is data available which has been leveraged substantially, and the increase in impact evaluations around that, it's huge. Sometimes or many times, national policies are more difficult to evaluate, but it's not impossible to evaluate. So it's just a matter of having quality and good data to be creative in terms of the design. And the other point I want to highlight in terms of what you were saying, Clarice, the availability of data of what is more easily measurable. So I'm thinking about outcomes. The fact that most commonly we measure outcomes on incomes or behavioral outcomes. I think that there is a high interest in longer term outcomes in well-being, in social relations, in governance, but we don't usually have that data to pair that to impact evaluation. So being creative and connecting better between those research questions with the data, I think it's still a challenge for this space. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to take a couple of more. So there is a question that's probably primarily for Clarice about, so given how much of the current evidence still focuses primarily on crop production, food availability, what do you see as the biggest challenges in generating more robust evidence on diet quality and nutrition outcomes under climate stress? And then another question that it would be good to hear thoughts from the panelists is around, so aside from formal evaluations and research, there's a wealth of evidence of the impact of climate interventions from program reports from organizations implementing projects on the ground. Is it possible to harvest these data, information, and stories of change to complement scientific evidence? And so it would be good to have your thoughts on this, because of course we recognize that there is a lot of information and evidence that exists, and you know the focus on causal evidence sometimes is taken to neglect what is there, and so your thoughts on how to best utilize what is available. Perhaps starting with Clarice.
If you can hear me, can you take the last question again? I had that.
So the last question is around how to better utilize evidence and information from program reports from implementing organizations. So the data and information and stories of change and how that can complement scientific evidence.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Betty. So I would say, so making sure that evaluations, or how do you call it, evidence is well available to policymakers, to researchers, I mean, those who need them. So in practicality, a few thoughts to better utilize them. So first, discoverability with regards to being the primary barrier. So program reports are usually scattered across institutional websites, donor portals, and organizational archives. So often unpublished or poorly indexed. So systematic efforts to register and deposit these reports in accessible repositories, such as, of course, the RIA's Development Evidence Portal or institutional grey literature databases, would improve their reach and usability for future synthesis work. Secondly, I would like to add that reporting standards matter. So many program reports lack the methodological detail needed to assess what was done, for whom, and with what results. So funders and implementing organizations could adapt minimum reporting standards, clearly describing the intervention, the population, the context. That's make reports genuinely usable for evidence synthesis without making reporting itself burdensome. Thirdly, EGMs and systematic reviews need to actively pursue great literature, as we did in our search strategy. But that only works if the reports exist in findable form. So the synthesis community and the programming community need a shared infrastructure, not just goodwill. Finally, there's a cultural shift needed. So program reports are too often written for compliance rather than learning. So refraining from contributions to a shared evidence base and resourcing them accordingly would unlock enormous value that is currently sitting unused in organizational filing systems. Yeah, thank you, Betty.
Jan?
Over to you, Jan.
Yeah, on this question of using also these program evaluations, I think it's a very critical point. And I think this is also about tearing down silos, because I think there are evaluation offices, for example, of the UN organizations that are collecting lots of these program evaluations, and we are not using them. And I think, but then if you think about it, it's also not so easy, because they are not often not they don't include so many outcome evaluations. It's more program evaluations. And what we are currently trying to do together with the SDG Synthesis Coalition is to actually link them with outcome evaluations to actually in mixed methods design. And the idea is, what we realize in our outcome evaluation work, our meta-analysis work, is that we are often, even though we are collecting lots of information to control for various factors, methodological aspects, but we are hitting a brick wall to understand the evidence beyond what works. And so the under what conditions and why is often missing. And for that, we need other synthesis designs and other forms of evidence that we need to bring in. And our hope is that there, the program evaluations can actually complement the outcome evaluation evidence very productively. I can't report on any success, but at least this is the road we are trying at the moment. But it's definitely a field that I think is super relevant and requires more attention. And I think it's a super important point.
Okay. Finally, a question to all of the panelists. What is your vision for the evidence community to better serve decision making for climate action, particularly given the current funding landscape with restricted ODA flows and climate finance? What would greater ambition, coordination, and investment look like? And then we go to Constanza, Martin, Clarice, and Jan.
Thank you, Birte. I'd like to touch on 3 points for the discussion here. One is around what you just said at the end, a better coordination, and not only at the research level, but also as a coalition, pushing collectively, excuse me, towards more evidence-informed decision making across governments, funders, implementers. Of course, we would benefit from better visibility of our own work, but to avoid duplication of efforts and build from our own research. But I think most importantly, we would benefit from promoting an evidence culture as a coordinated front. Secondly, better engagement strategies to embed evidence more directly into future research and programming decisions. Too often, methodological rigor and contextual relevance are treated as competing priorities, but our work shows that it's both possible and important to apply robust inference methods to evaluate climate programs while staying grounded in context. And third, it's around more innovation. We need to develop and perhaps co-develop innovative and evidence-driven approaches to policy and programming. I mentioned before the large use of quasi-experimental designs, and I think that just opens up possibilities. We are involved in a number of impact evaluations on climate resilience agriculture programs, combining quasi-experimental designs with remote sense data, satellite data, for approximately 1/3 of the cost of a traditional evaluation with traditional fieldwork. Or the same use of AI tools that we know some of us are developing to reduce the cost and time to conduct synthesis. So just big coordinated ideas and engagement to match the big challenges in climate. Thanks.
Martin, and I think we all need to be a bit brief.
Got it.
As we're coming up to the hour.
Got it, yeah. So really rich discussion. We need to do more with less. So we have an opportunity to standardize and harmonize living evidence syntheses, and some of the foundations are in place with ESSIC and METIUS and also the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative. But with less ODA and less climate finance, we're going to have some challenges, or some organizations may have challenges. So there are a couple of points quickly. Firstly, organizations with a really long track record of delivering evidence on what works across sectors and across many clients are likely to thrive in the context of lower finance. But perhaps newer organizations with a limited focus across sectors and limited clients, may need to partner and cluster together a bit to get through this period of limited finance. The last point I'd like to make is just organizations with a track record of working with the private sector are probably likely to do well in this period. Why do I say that? Well, it's because climate finance is changing, it's evolving. There are more financial instruments, there's more innovation in financial instruments. Finance is starting to see climate investments as an opportunity, not as a requirement. So these are the actors who benefit from knowing what works for whom at what cost, and that's what evidence brings to the table.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So maybe I'll take over from there. So for me, in a tighter funding environment, the evidence community needs to be much more strategic, and that's prioritize depth over breadth, and ensure that what gets studied or evaluated is mostly what needs to be known. So there are three things. First, close the geographic and intervention gaps deliberately. Like I mentioned, Central Africa, livestock systems, fisheries, energy are not niche priorities. Secondly, we need to invest in better study designs. The dominance of, for example, in our studies, summative and non-experimental work means we cannot reliably answer causal questions. So that is not about demanding randomized trials everywhere. That is neither feasible nor appropriate. But more causal experimental designs, better use of administrative data, and more systematic reviews of mature clusters would significantly improve the quality of inference available to decision makers. Third, we need to localize the evidence enterprise. African research institutions need to be leading producers of this evidence, not just data collection sites for externally led studies. So this requires sustained investment in research capacity, not just project by project funding cycles. So evidence that is locally generated, locally owned, and locally applicable is more likely to actually reach and influence policy in our context. So in conclusion, I'll say that constrained funding is not just a challenge. It is an opportunity to be more intentional. So the evidence community's greatest contribution right now is not producing more of the same, but ensuring that every research investment targets a genuine gap and also builds local capacity. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I tried to be brief. It was already said we need to be thrifty, we need to build collective impact, use AI responsible to make evidence synthesis faster, cheaper, and more effective. And I think we need to build an evidence bank that everybody can use and seamlessly get access to evidence much more rapidly. Second point, we need user-driven evidence. We need to create evidence that matters in all areas and not only in certain clusters. I think that's the second critical point, and I think that's in resource-constrained times more important than ever. And then I think we need to build a close-knitted community across the What Works community, across the What Works space. I think that's super important. That's what we are also trying to do. And I hope next week we will announce the next What Works Climate Solutions Summit in Cape Town in April 2027. So watch out, and I hope to see many of you there.
Excellent. And that brings us to the close of the session. Thank you all for such insightful discussion. Thanks to our audience for excellent questions. We've not been able to address all of them, but we will look at ways to be able to do that. Perhaps in a follow-up email or something like this. My sincere thanks to our panelists, our partners at the What Works Climate Solutions, and to the 3IE team for making this event possible. And a very warm thank you to the audience for joining us today. This conversation has helped us reflect not only on the climate evidence already available, but also how we can build on it in ways that are more strategic and coordinated for greater impact. As we've heard today, there is both an urgent need and a real opportunity to strengthen evidence-informed climate action. The case for greater ambition, coordination, and strategic investment is compelling, and this series is our invitation to help build that momentum together. And so we have a couple of events coming up. There are details in the chat for how to register. We very much hope that you will join us, and looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you.